most sought-after object in human history, and the most mysterious. It's the Holy Grail. In the 12th century legend of King Arthur, a gallant knight embarked on a lifelong journey to find it. The Grail was described as dazzling, mystical, and endowed with supernatural power. But it was also elusive. Its story has captivated generations of scholars, romantics, and treasure hunters. Modern Grail seekers have searched in the ruins of a medieval castle in Wales, in the hiding place of a secret brotherhood in France, even in the enigmatic symbols of ancient pagan rituals. Could the Grail be the actual cup Jesus drank from at the Last Supper? Now, follow in the footsteps of the Knights of the Round Table as we go in pursuit of the Holy Grail. In the legend of King Arthur, the most precious object in Christendom was the Holy Grail. So brilliant it was invisible, the Grail was the only object on earth that came from another world, a divine world. To see it was to stand in the presence of God. From the beginning, this extraordinary object has been relentlessly hunted. It is said that only the pure of mind and body can see it, and those who do will be blinded by its awesome power. In its many variations, it has been described as a plate, a stone, a cauldron, and more recently, a chalice. To Christians, the Holy Grail is the cup Jesus drank from at the Last Supper. It is said that Christ's devoted disciple, Joseph of Arimathea, then used the cup to catch the blood of Christ as he hung on the cross. Today, the Grail is more than a religious symbol. Its lure is based on the belief that it still exists somewhere, shrouded in secrecy. Over the centuries, many claim to have found it. But legend has it the real Holy Grail will leave no doubt of its authenticity once it is truly found. As it was for the knights of old, the search for the Holy Grail begins long before the Middle Ages. Glastonbury in the southwest of England is steeped in Grail legend. Here, rising above the town, is an unusual cone-shaped hill crowned by a medieval chapel. According to English tradition, the Grail is buried under this hill, called Glastonbury Tor. Today, the site is a magnet for disciples of New Age spirituality, and the Holy Grail has become a potent New Age symbol.
And if you drink from the Grail, well, you're drinking the magical elixir of life, and you're going to reach the spiritual plane.
The story of how the Holy Grail came to Glastonbury begins far away, in Jerusalem in 33 AD. After the crucifixion, Christ supposedly appeared in a flash of light and entrusted the Grail to his servant, Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph, who had given his tomb for the burial of Jesus, was arrested when Christ's body disappeared. When the disciple was finally cleared and released from prison, he fled from Jerusalem, bringing the sacred cup and a new religion to the British Isles. It's believed by many that the Holy Grail still lies hidden beneath Glastonbury Tor, washed by the waters of a subterranean stream. A spring called Chalice Well, emanating from the hill, is considered sacred and infused with curing powers. Pilgrims also pay homage to a time when Glastonbury was thought to be the fabled Isle of Avalon, where the most famous figure in the Grail legend, King Arthur, was taken to be healed after his last battle. Here at Glastonbury, it is said, sleep Arthur and his knights of the Round Table, Lancelot, Galahad, and Percival, ready to rise again when the country needs them. But King Arthur was not the first to seek the Holy Grail, and Glastonbury was not the last to claim it. Some say it's in Scotland, or perhaps Wales. Others in France. To find it requires peeling away layers of folklore and history. As recently as the 19th century, Victorian art and poetry was filled with imagery that linked the Grail to the ancient home of the Celts. Could the precious relic be hidden under some idyllic ruin? This is Castle Dinas Bran, near Llangollen in Wales. Victorian romantics thought this was the Grail Castle, the home of the mysterious Fisher King. In the earliest versions of the Grail story, the Fisher King suffers from a wound that will not heal. He lingers perpetually near death but does not die. The wound has turned his kingdom into a barren wasteland. Only someone seeking the Grail can cure him and restore the land to fertility. But the journey to the Grail Castle is fraught with obstacles. Historian Dr. Juliet Wood, an expert on the Holy Grail, has traced the story of the Fisher King to its possible link with the castle in Wales.
Castle Dinas Bran seemed to fit some of the requirements of the Grail castles in the romances. It was on a hill, it had a river round it, where the rich fisher could catch his fish. The Fisher King is one of the key figures in the Grail. He is the wounded king. Sometimes he's called the maimed king. Some people think it's a sexual wound, that he's been emasculated. But certainly he is the one who is going to be cured when the Grail Seeker asks the correct question.
The Fisher King is a recurring theme in the Grail legend. King Arthur, also a wounded king, is another. Over time, in many versions of the Grail story, these two kings have often become one. The first person to go in search of the sacred relic was a young man named Percival. Recently knighted by King Arthur, Percival had just left Camelot when he lost his way and accidentally came upon a castle on a hill. The Grail Castle. To find the mysterious object and heal the Fisher King, Percival had to ask the question, whom does the Grail serve?
The Grail is an object, an unclear object, which the hero has to look for. He starts out from Arthur's court. He undergoes a series of very complicated adventures. He arrives at the Grail Castle, where he is shown a mysterious procession. The hero fails to ask the question, whom does the Grail serve? As the result of which the land is made waste, the hero has to start his adventures all over again. Clearly it's a journey of self-discovery, and at the end, he asks the question, whom does the Grail serve? The Fisher King is healed, the Grail land becomes fruitful, and the hero goes back to Camelot.
The story of the Grail seemed to appear out of nowhere around the 12th century AD. Was it born out of the fertile imagination of a gifted writer, or can its roots be traced further back? This is Tara, the Celtic capital of Ireland and one of the oldest pre-Christian sites in Europe, dating back to 3000 BC. Here, for thousands of years, the kings of pagan Ireland were crowned and her gods worshipped. And here at Tara, an intriguing clue can be found that may be the origin of a pre-Christian Grail story. The ancient Irish kings were inexorably linked to the land. The fertility of the land meant survival. To ensure their prosperity, the Celts revered a magic vessel they called the Cauldron of Plenty. In some parts of Ireland, the symbolism of the cauldron was taken to extremes. A new king had to mate with the gods by first mating with a white mare. Then he wallowed in the cauldron and ate the mare's meat as it was being cooked. A bonding ritual with the gods, even the king became part of the sacrificial meal. Among the treasures unearthed at Tara are two gold necklaces that archaeologists think may have adorned the statues of a primeval god and goddess. The Celts had many gods, but the most powerful of all was a terrifying figure with huge appetites named Dagda, who mated with the river goddess Boyne. Dagda's mythical dwelling place can be found by following the river Boyne to a valley full of ancient earthworks. This is New Grange, a Stone Age tomb dating back to 3200 BC, 500 years before Egypt's first pyramid. Inside are dark secrets and the echoes of ancient rites. The link between the Grail and New Grange comes from its most famous inhabitant, Dagda, the father of the gods. By 500 BC, the entrance to the tomb had collapsed. Unaware of its original purpose, the Celts wove stories about the mysterious monument. They believed it was Dagda's home, and that he possessed a cauldron which would only cook food for a hero. The food of a coward would never be in it, according to Celtic myth. The magic vessel could also feed an army without ever being replenished. The giant cauldron could hold a stew made up of 40 whole sheep, goats, and pigs, and 80 measures each of milk, meal, and fat. The aroma never failed to please the awesome Dagda. The cauldron served as a melting pot of sacrificial gifts to the god. In return, it had the power to invoke either feast or famine, life or death. It's as if this vast cosmic cauldron contained within it the whole world vision of the Celts. Was this sacred vessel the Celtic Grail? Cauldrons were not only associated with fire, but also water. Water was holy to the Celts. That cauldrons held water only added to their sacred nature. Understanding the importance of the cauldrons is key to unlocking the mysteries of Celtic mythology, according to an authority on pagan cultures, Miranda Green.
Cauldrons in pagan Celtic myths seem to have had a tremendous significance. It's quite complicated, really, because they seem to represent rebirth, regeneration, and plenty, but at the same time they're also vessels of death. The good side seemed to have been associated with miraculous powers of resurrecting the dead, for example, and also being continuous providers of food that's never exhausted, a bit like sort of loaves and fishes in the parable. As vessels of death, they seem to have been symbolic in terms of human sacrifice. There was a particular ritual involving the sacrifice of war prisoners, which involved priestesses whose job it was to cut the throats of war prisoners and catch the blood in a sacred cauldron.
The blood of a human sacrifice caught in a sacred cauldron, 600 years before the crucifixion of Christ. In another Celtic story that foreshadows the resurrection, the dead are dipped headfirst into a cauldron and restored to life. The myths surrounding cauldrons read like fairy tales until 1911, when an astonishing discovery was made in Wales. While dredging a lake called Clynfawr, workmen uncovered some unusual objects dating back to 600 BC. The most spectacular were these large vessels made of sheet bronze. Cauldrons sacrificed to a lake may seem strange, but it was not unusual for the ancient Celts, who believed that lakes and rivers were the domain of the gods.
The significance of lakes like this one, and rivers and marshes, seems to have been something to do with the properties of water itself. I mean, if you look at the lake here, you'll see that it's a solid sheet of water which reflects the hills and the woodlands around it very well indeed. And I think that relates to a feeling that water was a kind of liminal space, that is a space on the edge between this world and the other world. Now, if we can project this back into antiquity, what we're getting is gifts to the gods who are thought to dwell underneath the surface of the water.
From the beginning, the cauldrons belonged to the gods. They were not of this world. They evoked magic and wonder, and the supernatural. But cauldrons were also elusive and unpredictable. In an early Welsh poem, King Arthur leads his men to the other world to steal a magic cauldron. This cauldron apparently had a personality of its own. It needed the breath of 9 virgins to heat it, and like Dagda's cauldron, it too would only feed a hero. In the end, Arthur did steal it from the Lord of the Underworld, but at the massive cost of almost all his forces. 3,000 years ago, a primitive vessel had the power to determine the destiny of kings. It controlled the fertility of the land, augured death, and held out the promise of life. The Celt indulged in bizarre rituals to procure the blessings of the cauldron. And the Celts were not the only pagans to worship a sacred vessel. Ancient Romans were also devoted to their gods, especially Bacchus, the god of wine. Beneath a makeshift tent in the English county of Wiltshire are ruins of a Roman villa dating back to the 3rd century. Here, near the northernmost edge of Rome's vast empire, colonists venerated the enigmatic gods they had brought with them from the Mediterranean. This striking mosaic floor suggests a shrine dedicated to the wine god Bacchus. These panthers, whose strength and beauty were often associated with Bacchus, are shown flanking a vessel brimming with wine. They are about to increase their power by consuming the god in the form of wine. It's thought these animals represent human worshippers seeking eternal life. On a Roman figurine found in London, Bacchus is described as the god who gives life to wandering men. Hominibus Bacchus Vitam, which suggests he's a god of salvation. Roman gods and goddesses promised salvation to those who partook of them through food and drink. Ceres, the corn goddess, could be eaten, and Bacchus, the wine god, was imbibed from a cup. Now the modern magic of virtual reality brings this ancient Roman villa back to life. A villa in which many a banquet would have led to a bacchanal, or drunken orgy. Vivid description of such a bacchanal. He observed that, encouraged by erotic music and dancing, participants sipped from goblets made sacred by the wine of the god. As religious experience and wild party intertwined, the ritual built to a climax as Bacchus entered their bodies. Intoxicated with Bacchus, whose body was the wine, revelers finally abandoned themselves to the orgy until they and the god had become one. From the wine of a pagan god to the blood of Christ may take a leap of faith. But the legend of the Holy Grail is full of arcane symbols and obscure rituals. Soon all the primitive myths embodied in a sacred vessel would begin to coalesce into an object more powerful than any that had come before. But first, there would be one more transformation. Living in the shadow of the Roman Empire was a culture with a relic that may be the actual precursor of the Holy Grail. For 3,000 years, Jews around the world have celebrated Passover with a cup to remember the Exodus from Egypt. Jesus was a Jew well-versed in Hebrew tradition. Today, most biblical scholars agree that the Last Supper was a Passover meal.
As they were eating, Jesus took bread and blessed and broke it and said, "This is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them and said, "This is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for the many. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life."
Today, the same ritual, called the Eucharist, is the culmination of the Catholic Mass. The vessel sacred to Christians is lifted towards heaven as bread and wine are transformed into the body and blood of Christ.
Tu es béni, Dieu de l'univers, toi qui nous donnes ce vin, de la vie et le travail des hommes. Que nous présentons, il deviendra pour nous le
According to British theologian Rowan Williams, the whereabouts of the Holy Grail is no mystery.
The Grail is, in the sense that matters, there at every Eucharist. Christ is there at every Mass. There's nothing to look for. So there's no mysterious secret about this grace-giving presence of Jesus Christ in the Last Supper. It's here. Materially, literally here. Christ is not a distant person, and the cup of the Last Supper is not a strange, lost, magical object, because Christ is as present now as he was at the Last Supper, and whatever cup he pours his blood into now is the Grail.
If the Church is right, consuming the body and blood of Christ through bread and wine is the closest most of us will ever come to finding the Holy Grail. It's the promise of redemption that's priceless, not the cup. But through the centuries, the existence of a tangible relic with magical powers would continue to haunt even the most devout. In the Middle Ages, the quest for a real Holy Grail, not salvation, occupied sinners and saints alike. This magnificent monastery in France was made famous by a Cistercian monk named Bernard of Clairvaux, who became its abbot in 1115. Bernard was a saint and the greatest thinker of his time. The cathedral in nearby Troyes is famous for only one relic, his skull. But from that skull flowed some astonishing new ideas unheard of in the 12th century. Bernard believed that only God was worth dying for, and that a holy war was a grand adventure. But to be victorious, a crusader needed some lofty rules to live by, which Bernard dutifully penned.
A knight should be virtuous and prepared to fight to the death. He is never to decline battle, even when outnumbered, never to accept ransom, and never to cry for mercy. A knight should be poor, chaste, yet kind to women. Love ennobles a man. If he abides by these rules, then there is happiness for the martyr, and glory for the conqueror.
These Cistercian virtues of charity, chastity, and love became the code of chivalry made famous by the legend of King Arthur. They also inspired a new caste of priestly warriors that would bring honor to the Crusades. The secret order known as the Knights Templar was founded in 1119 AD to protect pilgrims en route to the Holy Land, and to defend Jerusalem and the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb of Christ. Before the arrival of the Templars, a medieval knight was anything but perfect, according to Oxford professor of French literature, Tony Hunt.
There is no doubt that chivalry is not a good word to describe what in practice was looting, destruction wreaked by knights who were little different from what we might refer to today as yobs. In other words, there was a very violent society developing in 12th century France, and one of the ways in which this violence could be curbed and channeled was to try to provide some sort of ethical upgrading of knighthood. And you see this, of course, with the crusade and the way in which they can redeem themselves and the chivalry by going to fight for God.
Thousands of Templar knights died on the battlefield defending the Christian faith. But thousands more returned home from the Holy Land and quietly made their way across Europe with a fortune in gold and sacred relics taken from Jerusalem. The treasure lay hidden for centuries and to this day has never been found. Even now, there are those who believe the Templar Knights still exist and remain the secret guardians of the Holy Grail. A short distance from Clairvaux, at Avalure, is a working farm that was once part of a Templar settlement. To the casual observer, the chapel looks like a medieval landmark. But far less conspicuous are the intriguing symbols on a building nearby. The barn bears the crest of the Crusaders, a holy cross. Concealed in the barn, far away from prying eyes, are vestiges of the Templars more in keeping with their image as a secret brotherhood. When this wall collapsed some years ago, the farmers here found pottery, wine jugs, and ceramics dating back to medieval times. But there were no signs of the Templars' fabled treasure or the Holy Grail. If the monks of Clairvaux Monastery once knew where it was, they remained silent on the subject. The Templar Knights, too, took their secrets to the grave, but the power of the written word would soon heighten the mystique of the sacred cup. A 2-hour drive southeast of Paris, in the Champagne region of France, is the birthplace of the Grail legend in literature. Its author was Chrétien de Troyes, considered by most scholars the greatest literary genius of the French Middle Ages. Today, the city of Troyes is a living museum of medieval architecture. It was here, around 1175 AD, that Chrétien wrote the oldest surviving story of the Grail. Ironically, his Grail was neither a cup, nor was it holy. In Chrétien's time, the French word Grail meant a common platter or large dish for serving food. His poetry changed the meaning of the word forever by introducing it into a scene of great mystery and symbolic power.
A maiden accompanying the two young men was carrying a grail with her two hands. She was beautiful, noble, and richly attired. After she'd entered the hall carrying the grail, the room was so brightly illuminated that the candles lost their brilliance, like the stars and the moon when the sun rises. After her came another maiden, carrying a silver carving platter. The grail, which was introduced first, was a fine, pure gold. Set in the grail were precious stones of many kinds, the best and costliest to be found in earth or sea.
Chrétien drew on Celtic folklore, Anglo-Saxon history, and oral accounts of Arthur to weave a mystical saga of a wounded king, a young knight, and the quest for a relic with supernatural power, the Grail. Europe in the 12th century was full of relics. Every church worth its salt had a bone or a scrap of cloth from a saint. Some even claimed to have objects relating to Christ himself. A precious fragment of Calvary's cross, or a piece of his robe. Chrétien's Grail, born into a culture obsessed with relics, became the ultimate relic. A Grail became the Grail.
The Grail passed again in front of them, and again the youth did not ask who was served from the Grail. He held back, because the elders had gently admonished him not to talk too much, and he kept his warning constantly to heart. But he kept more silent than he should have, because with each course that was served, he saw the Grail pass by completely uncovered before him. But he did not learn who was served from it.
Chrétien de Troyes died in 1190 before the story was finished, but his mysterious Grail was so powerful it wasn't long before it became the Holy Grail. It would be another literary work, one written in English, that would capture the hearts and minds of generations of Grail seekers and redefine a new class of knight. The Grail Knight. All the elements of mysticism and romance converged in Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur. In it he weaves the legend of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, the most famous Grail legend of them all. With Malory, the story of the Grail had finally come full circle. But not the search to find it. The Grail seekers of old and those who followed them down through the ages wanted the Grail to be more than a literary symbol. They wanted to summon its magic and unleash its power. In the 19th century, Victorian romantics were captivated by the Grail and the chivalry it evoked. For a major group of artists, the Pre-Raphaelites, King Arthur and the Holy Grail were an endless source of inspiration. The greatest poet of the day, Alfred Lord Tennyson, believed the power of the Grail was real and could be harnessed by anyone who was a devoted follower of Christ. In Idylls of the King, Tennyson eloquently envisioned seeing it for the first time.
Sweet brother, I have seen the Holy Grail. For waked at dead of night, I heard a sound as of a silver horn from o'er the hills blown. And then streamed through my cell a cold and silver beam, and down the long beam stole the Holy Grail, rose red with beatings in it as if alive. And then the music faded, and the Grail passed, and the beam decayed, and from the walls the rosy quiverings died into the night.
For most 19th century thinkers, the Grail was not a tangible object, but a symbolic one. To possess it was to know the secrets of the universe. For the first time in history, manpower was giving way to machines, and the landscape was dramatically changing. British Victorians were confident they'd found the Holy Grail in the technology of the new Industrial Revolution. upright, God-fearing people, they imagined themselves the pinnacle of Darwinian evolution and models of the Grail Knights of old. In short, they believed the Holy Grail was the miracle behind their runaway success. While the English hung their hopes on the power of the Grail, a rare and unusual object was tucked away in a country house in Wales. In 1878, the Powells, a well-known family living near Aberystwyth, put a treasured heirloom on display. Although the family was cautious at first, an amazing story grew up around the family's mysterious cup. This legend, too, begins in Glastonbury. King Henry VIII had broken with the church and was about to tear down the monastery. A cup from within was spirited away to Strata, Florida, a remote Cistercian abbey in Wales. The last surviving monk entrusted it to the squire of Strata, Florida, and through marriage it came into the Powell family. Could it be the same Holy Grail that Joseph of Arimathea allegedly brought to Glastonbury? At the Powell family home, called Nanteos, the cup was kept in a box along with letters and notes testifying to the miracle cures associated with it.
8th of February 1858. Cup lent to Isaac Hughes for his wife. Left £1. Cured.
I thank you with all my heart that the water from the Holy Grail cup has cured me of arthritis. I ran up and down my kitchen, even jumped up and down. I knelt down and thanked God.
Even the great composer Richard Wagner purportedly paid a visit to Nanteos to see the cup. Inspired by the relic and another version of the Grail story written by a 12th century German poet, he sat in the music room and made notes for his famous opera Parsifal about the young knight in search of the Holy Grail. This is that music. Today, the cup is kept in a bank vault. Special permission to film it was granted by a member of the Powell family who was concealing her identity to protect the cup from would-be Grail seekers. She'll never forget the first time she saw it.
I think it was one evening after we arrived at Nantes. It was kept in the cupboard in the library, and the door was opened and the cup was brought out to us. We were all absolutely amazed, and when we saw it we felt the power and the responsibility. It's a great responsibility because it's such an irreplaceable item, being the cup of the Last Supper.
Today, the cup bears the scars of its fame. The Powells think the damage was caused by overzealous pilgrims nibbling on it as they drank. Could this modest vessel be the sacred relic that could make the blind see and the lame walk? Is the Nanteos cup the Holy Grail? Not everyone thinks so.
The Nanteus cup is actually a medieval mazer bowl, which is just simply a bowl that would have been used to put food in, not a sacred vessel at all. But when Nanteus was built, partly on the ruins of Strata, Florida, there was a certain amount of digging going on, and this object clearly turned up. And it was probably always a broken object, as it is now, but because it was a medieval object, it was saved by the family, and it was sort of passed on. But what it is wych elm, not olive wood, and a broken medieval object. Now, when you get these single objects, particularly at country houses, they often attract legends to them. And what more wonderful legend than the Holy Grail?
If the Holy Grail does exist, it remains elusive. But real or imagined, for 5,000 years, the hopes and dreams of humanity have been embodied in a sacred vessel. The ancient Celts saw in a bronze cauldron the promise of renewal and the resurrection of life. The Romans sought superhuman strength in the chalice of a pagan god. For Jews at Passover, another sacred goblet symbolizes freedom from bondage and persecution. For Christians, the Last Supper sanctified a humble cup over which Christ said, "This is my blood." Whom does the Grail serve? Medieval writers asked. Has the mystery been solved? Today, there are those who still seek the Grail in remnants of medieval castles and in secret settlements of the mysterious Templar Knights. And beneath ancient mounds and Stone Age tombs. Techno-Knights search for the Grail at amusement arcades, in computer games, jousting with joysticks rather than lances. They continue the quest, not in the medieval countryside, but in cyberspace. The Holy Grail lives on as an ever-changing vessel with magical powers to link us with another world.